Okay, now we're moving on into the study of another type of learning, one that is considered to be more complex, and that is the type of learning that was first examined by a true giant in the field of psychology by the name of B.F. Skinner. So this is lecture number 13 now. We're going to be talking about Skinner. We're going to be talking about a little bit of history here that led up to Skinner's work. So let's begin by exploring a little bit of history. This individual that you see here on the right, this is E.L. Thorndike. He was a very distinguished psychologist, studied animal learning in the 1890s at Columbia University. And he conducted some classic work in this area that involved confronting animals with some problems and then looking to see how those animals actually were able to confront those problems and solve those problems. This particular experiment is one that is considered probably to be his most famous. This is simply called the cat in the puzzle box. And what you see here is a cat that has been placed inside of this box. You can see a plate of fish that's on the outside of the box. Cats love fish. The objective of the cat, of course, is to try to escape from this box and obtain the fish. So the cat is placed in the box, a box that it's never been in before. And of course, the cat doesn't know that if it pushes this little red bar that you see here, that it's going to cause this latch to open up, and the cat, these doors will open, and the cat will be able to escape and then to obtain the fish. Again, Thorndike examines this in these cats, puts them in this box every day, and examines their behavior. So what happens on the first day is the cat wanders around, exhibits a lot of what we would call ineffective behavioral responses, kind of explores the box, the corners of the box, tries to reach out through the bars of the cage, as you see here, but the behaviors are ones that aren't leading to escape and ultimately to obtain the fish. But then, quite by accident, the cat happens to bump into this bar, and what it does is it releases this latch, and the door opens up, and the cat is able to get the fish. The next day, the cat is placed in the cage. Again, you see all of these random behaviors that don't really lead to escape and reinforcement, but then eventually the cat does push this bar. The cat escapes and gets the fish. So again, we're doing this every day now. Thorndike is doing this every day, and he's exploring the behavior that is exhibited by so this is something that Thorndike referred to as trial and error learning. And indeed, what he finds is that the behaviors, responses that don't lead to reinforcement, these ineffectual responses, they eventually start to go away. And responses that gain release and lead to the reward are strengthened, and they're more likely to occur. Indeed, what he finds is after about 3 or 4 days, the animal, the cat, upon being placed into the box, almost immediately goes to the red bar and pushes it so that it can get out. This is in contrast to what happens on the first few days, where the cat doesn't really understand the connection between the bar and gaining access to the fish. And he calls this trial and error learning. And if we take a look at the amount of time that it takes the animal to escape over trials, this was done over a 60-day period of time, one trial each day. And what you see is that the cat's behavior dramatically improves to a point where they're gaining release almost immediately upon being placed into the box. That is, they go over, push the bar, and by pushing the bar, they're able to have that door open up and able to obtain the food. So again, this is called a learning curve. This is the improvement that you see in performance over trials. Again, this is evident we see in almost every single type of learning, whether we're talking about fruit flies or we're talking about human beings or we're talking about fish or any species. They tend to show this improvement in performance over trials. And again, this is called the learning curve. On the basis, Thorndike develops some what he calls laws of learning. The law of exercise, in which he simply says that there are these stimulus-response connections. They're strengthened by practice. The law of effect, in contrast, says that stimulus-response connections are strengthened by reward. So again, these two laws of learning, he feels, govern all types of learning: law of exercise and the law of now, he was only partially correct. It's simply not the case that practice makes perfect. Rewarded practice certainly makes perfect, but simply practicing something over and over and over again in which you're rewarded doesn't necessarily lead to learning. So another kind of a transitional person comes along the way by the name of Wolfgang Kohler. And Wolfgang Kohler really believed that animals are intellectually capable of a lot more sophisticated things than simple trial and error learning. And what he did was to confront chimpanzees and other primates with more complex kinds of problems. One such problem is illustrated here. What Kohler did was to confront chimpanzee with a situation where they were in a cage and there was a plate of bananas that was outside the cage, which was beyond the reach of the animal. But if they used a stick that was in the cage, they could use that as a tool in order to bring the plate of bananas closer to it and eventually be able to grab the bananas and eat them. But what would happen if you placed the plate of bananas outside the cage to a point where just using that one stick wouldn't be enough? And if you place two sticks that could be joined together with one another, almost like you would with a fishing pole, the two sticks are placed in there, they're apart from each other, and it's the job of the chimpanzees to take those two sticks, put them together, so now they can obtain the plate of bananas, which is now, twice as far away. And what he found was that the animals struggled at this. The chimpanzees struggled. Using one stick was ineffective. And this went on for a series of days. But then all of a sudden, one day, what he observed when the two sticks were in the cage was that the animal, the chimpanzee, took the two sticks, joined them together, and was able to now, because they were joined together and the stick was quite long, it was now long enough to bring the plate closer to the animal. Now, this research was done between 1910 and 1917, and it suggested to Wolfgang Kohler that chimpanzees are really capable of what he called insight learning, which he meant being able to rapidly perceive a relationship. In this case, the relationship of being able to use those two sticks more effectively by placing them together. So this is kind of a transitional point before we get to the work of B.F. Skinner. And what we want to do is we want to talk about his work now. So Thorndike and Kohler lead up to the work that was conducted by B.F. Skinner. So let's talk a little bit about one of psychology's greatest pioneer, absolutely a giant in the field of psychology. B.F. Skinner grew up in Pennsylvania and was a very good student. He was very interested in English. And he ended up going to Hamilton College, which is in upstate New York. And after graduating from Hamilton College, he went back to his hometown in Pennsylvania and he became a journalist writing for a local newspaper. But that soon proved not to be very challenging for B.F. Skinner. He had been doing some reading at this time, reading about the work of Ivan Pavlov, reading about the work of John Watson, and he became very inspired by both of those individuals, ultimately went on to Harvard University and obtained his doctoral degree in experimental psychology at Harvard University. He ultimately became a member of the faculty there at Harvard University, and he produced absolutely fascinating results that were designed really to control, to examine the effects of controlling behavior by using reward, by using consequences. And he did work with a variety of different species, with rats and with pigeons and with human beings as well. And this work is considered to be some of the greatest in the field of, some of the most important in the field of psychology. He also developed an apparatus that was called an air crib that was used in order to take a look at some of these principles of learning in young children, these principles that he was developing. And later he developed what is called the Skinner box, which we will talk about. Here's the Skinner box that you see right here. And we'll talk about that as we go along and talk about his experiments. His work became very important as it was translated to the classroom and what is now referred to as program learning. It's all based upon the principles of Skinnerian operant conditioning. And his research really provided the basis for a type of therapy that is called the token economy. His work provided the basis for what are called individual behavior plans that you see for young children in the school setting, maybe children that are suffering from attention deficit disorder. And he really is the founder of what we would call applied behavior analysis, a very important subdiscipline in the field of psychology. So let me emphasize one very important thing here, and that is what Skinner is saying is that rats and humans are absolutely identical in terms of how they go about learning. And again, I'm going to emphasize that over and over and over again, because indeed the principles of learning that he has discovered are ones that you will see influence every single aspect of our life over the course of a day. So let's begin by taking a look at his experiments in the laboratory in the same way in which we took a look at the experiments that were conducted by Ivan Pavlov in his laboratory in the Soviet Union. So Skinner's essential ingredients for learning. That's the first thing that we need to come to grips with and the first thing that we need to discuss. Skinner says, first of all, motivation must be established. Motivation is incredibly important for the learning process. If an organism is not motivated to learn, then chances are they will not learn. Secondly, Skinner says you have to specify exactly what it is that you're trying to teach this organism, whether it's a rat or whether it's a human being. You have to specify what he calls the terminal response. Third, he says you must work in a highly structured environment in order to promote learning. In other words, if there's a lot of competing, distracting things going on at the same time, then learning simply is not going to occur. So again, highly structured environment. And he says you must use what is called successive approximations or shaping, where you start out with only maybe parts of that final destination, that final response. You must encourage those things first, and indeed, ultimately, you're going to get to that terminal response that you're trying to shape, that you're trying to modify. But you have to start out in very small steps, and this is a process that he refers to as shaping. So, given what those requirements are, let's take a look now at how you would go about taking a rat who has been placed in this box that you see here, a box in which there's not a lot of distractions. how would you go about shaping an animal, a rat, to press a bar in order to receive a pellet of food that's going to come down into this tray? Rats do not enter the world knowing how to do this. Okay, so a rat that's placed in here for the first time, what you're going to do is you're going to make sure that this rat is a little bit hungry, and the way in which you would do that is to deprive the animal of food for a period of time, place it into this box, and typically what would happen is the same as what you saw with the cat in the puzzle box. That is to say, the rat would wander around a lot, would inspect the cage a great deal. But again, keep in mind that the requirement is the behavior that we're trying to shape, the behavior that the final destination, if you will, for this behavior is the animal to be reared up on its hind legs as it is here with its paws on the bar, pressing the bar down in order to produce a pellet of food. So what Skinner does is he engages in this process of successive approximations where the animal is wandering around, and when the animal is close to the bar, not touching it at all, but simply close to it, Skinner would press a button on the outside of the box that would cause a pellet of food to come down into the tray. So the animal would eat the food. And then the animal would start wandering around again. And now Skinner would say, well, now the animal has to be close to the bar, but also reared up on its hind legs before I give it a pellet of food. So he waits and he waits and he waits and he waits. And then ultimately what he finds is that the rat wanders around and it's close to the bar, starts to rear up. And at that point, right then and there, the rat is given another pellet of food. Indeed, this goes on now. The requirement, again, is made a little bit stiffer. Not only must the rat be near the bar, must be reared up on its hind legs, but now must have at least one paw on the bar. Doesn't have to be pressing the bar, just have a paw on it. And indeed, he waits and he waits and he waits, and then eventually the rat's close to the bar, rears up, happens to put its paw on the bar, and again, Skinner makes sure that he presses that button right at that time so that the animal is going to get that pellet of food. Now what he does is he waits again for the animal to be near the bar, reared up on its hind legs, one paw on the bar, and at least partially pressing the bar down. And at that point, again, he Skinner administers a pellet of food into the tray, and the animal eats the food. So this goes on for a period of time. All the time Skinner is doing is making the requirement a little bit more difficult, but eventually, after maybe an hour or so of doing this, the rat is regularly pressing the bar in order to obtain the food. So again, note all of the requirements, the motivation. The animal enters the situation slightly hungry. Note that there are really very few distractions in this situation. Note that he specified what the final behavior, the terminal behavior is, which is pressing of the bar in order to obtain the food. Note that he's using what's called shaping or successive approximations in order to obtain this particular response. So Skinner, now having established this, now says, you know what, that's not real life. It's not real life that every time the bar is depressed, we get a reinforcement for every response. So he says, I'm going to fool the animal. And I'm going to fool the animal by changing things up a little bit, requiring the animal to press the bar more times just to get one pellet of food, or requiring there to be a time delay. He then begins to explore what we now refer to as schedules of reinforcement. So again, let's take a look at these schedules of reinforcement. Certainly when a rat is in a situation like the one that we just described, where it's getting reinforcement, getting that pellet of food every time it presses the bar, this is referred to as continuous reinforcement, CRF. There are two basic types of schedules that reflect how we really learn. And again, this is observed in this table that you see here that we'll be referring to as we go along. Okay, there are interval schedules that are based upon the passage of time. We have fixed interval schedules that reinforce the first response after a constant amount of time goes by. Maybe 1 minute, for example, must go by before that bar press produces food, or maybe 2 minutes must go by before a bar press produces that food. That's called a fixed interval schedule. A variable interval schedule, there's reinforcement for the first response after a changing amount of time. It's going to be constantly changing. Sometimes it's 1 minute, sometimes it's 10 minutes, sometimes it's 30 seconds, sometimes it's 20 seconds. It's going to be constantly changing. Okay, that's called a variable interval schedule. Those schedules, interval schedules, are based upon the passage of time. Okay. Now, ratio schedules, those are based upon the number of responses that an organism exhibits. So, for example, a fixed ratio schedule, there must be completion of a constant number of responses. Maybe a fixed ratio schedule of 10. So the animal first 9 responses are not reinforced, but the 10th one is. Then the animal must exhibit another 9 responses, and on the 10th response, the animal's reinforced. And this goes on. So there's a response requirement here that is more than just one response. It could be 50 responses, could be 30, could be 20, but there's a set number of responses that are required. A variation of this ratio schedule, instead of fixed ratio, is what we call variable ratio, or VR schedule, completion of a changing number of responses. So, for example, at first, you might require the animal to make 5 responses, then maybe 20, then maybe 2, then maybe 50, then maybe 31, then maybe 16. This is something that is constantly changing, okay, is this requirement. So again, these schedules then, interval schedules and ratio schedules, these are the two basic types of schedules that really reflect how we really learn. This is what Skinner believes will help us to really understand the impact of reward upon behavior. Take a look now. This is just a summary of these concepts that we have here. Again, I think that it's important for you to go over that 2x2 table that was in the previous slide. Let's take a look now at the impact of these schedules of reinforcement upon the behavior of our rats. Here's our rat that is in a Skinner bar, the Skinner box. The rat has been shaped to press the bar. Every time it presses the bar, it's receiving a food reinforcement. So now this has been well established. And now what Skinner is going to do is he's going to fool the animal. He's going to fool the animal by placing it on one of these schedules of reinforcement. So the first one that we want to look at is that of a fixed interval schedule. In other words, a set amount of time must go by before the animal receives a reinforcement. Take a look at this table that you see here. This shows time, right? This is along the horizontal axis, and along the vertical axis, this is the cumulative number of bar presses that the animal exhibits. These slashes that you see here, the white slashes, this refers to a bar press that produces reinforcement. So if we take a look at what happens here, take a look at this. This is an animal now that has been placed upon a fixed interval schedule for an extended period of time. And what you see is, and again, we'll use as an example a fixed interval, let's say 10-minute schedule, where the animal is going to be reinforced for the first response that occurs after 10 minutes goes by. And what you see is this scalloping kind of an effect here, where the animal begins to time its behavior. In other words, very few responses early on in the interval, but as the interval comes down towards the end, the animal's bar pressing picks up. Again, here's a reinforcement here. 10 minutes has gone by. Now another 10 minutes must go by, and we see that the animal is not pressing the bar very much and doesn't press it until towards the end of the interval. So again, you see this scalloping effect. This is also called the timing schedule. The animals are learning how to time their behavior so that the maximizes when they get a reinforcement. They don't want to work very much during this interval because they know that they're not going to get a reinforcement. But then when they sense that they're towards the end of the interval, then they start pressing the bar. So that's this relatively low rate of responding that you see here, very characteristic of a fixed interval schedule. And you could have any kind of a fixed interval schedule. Fixed interval 1 minute, fixed interval 10 minutes, fixed interval 20 minutes, fixed interval 10 seconds. They all yield this kind of pattern that you see here. Another schedule based upon the passage of time is variable interval. And just to use for the purposes of illustration, let's say it's a variable interval 5-minute schedule, which means that on the average, after 5 minutes goes by, the animal is going to be reinforced. But it's going to be constantly changing. Sometimes it'll be after 5 minutes, sometimes after 20 minutes, sometimes after 2 minutes, sometimes after 10 minutes and 15 seconds. It's going to be changing, okay, but it is going to average out to 5 minutes. So what you see here is this pattern of reinforcement that occurs that is constantly changing, and it's changing because the interval is changing, okay, and you get this relatively low rate of responding. All of the fixed interval and variable interval schedules typically produce patterns of responding, patterns of bar pressing, right, that are much lower than what you see on ratio schedules that are dependent upon the number of responses that the organism is required to make. So let's now take a look at those ratio schedules, and first take a look at fixed ratio. And for the purposes of illustration, let's use a fixed ratio, let's say a 20 schedule, where the animal must exhibit 20 responses before, 20 bar presses before it receives a reinforcement. And again, what you see is that this incredibly high rate of responding, again, these slashes refer to a reinforced response. Again, every 20 responses that the animal makes produces a reinforcement. So again, you get this slight pausing that occurs right after a bar press that produces a pellet of food. The animal eats the food, then starts pressing again right away. So they know that they have to exhibit a lot of bar presses in order to get the food reinforcement. Now let's shift our attention to a variable ratio schedule. And for the purposes of illustration, let's use a variable ratio 15 schedule, which means that on the average, the animal has to exhibit 15 responses before it's going to receive a reinforcement for a bar press. But sometimes it's going to be after 15 bar presses, sometimes it's going to be after 30, sometimes it's going to be after 6 or 8 or 100, but it's going to average out to 15, okay? And what you see, again, is this incredibly high rate of responding, but you can see that the reinforcement is coming at irregular intervals. Because again, here's a very short requirement, meaning that not many bar presses are required. Here's a requirement where a lot of bar presses are required. Here, relatively short. Again, this produces incredibly high rates of responding that you see here. So again, these schedules of reinforcement, he believes, really operate to modify our behavior and to change our behavior in very, very predictable kinds of ways. Let's talk about one other really important experiment, and then I want you to see how this applies to your everyday living. This is something that's called the partial reinforcement effect. Skinner asked the question, what would happen if an animal was placed upon a schedule like a continuous reinforcement schedule, for example, where it was receiving a pellet of food for every single time it pressed the bar? What would happen if the animal was then placed upon extinction, where it is no longer receiving a pellet of food when it presses the bar? Well, here's what happens. This shows cumulative number of responses here. This is the passage of time. And this dotted line here refers to everything to the right of it, means that the animal is no longer receiving a reinforcement for, no longer receiving a pellet of food for every time it presses the bar. So here's an animal that's on continuous reinforcement, gets a pellet of food every time it presses the bar. Now at this point, it's not receiving a pellet of food. The animal keeps pressing the bar, but for a relatively short period of time. Right now, this flat line means the animal's no longer pressing the bar. Let's see where time-wise this animal has stopped. In other words, it's extinction. The animal no longer is pressing the bar in order to get food. Right. Now let's take a look at an animal that's been placed upon a schedule, what we call a partial reinforcement schedule, where every response does not produce a food reinforcement. And for the purposes of illustration, let's use a fixed ratio schedule. Let's say a fixed ratio 20 schedule, where every 20th bar press produces a pellet of food. You see that the animal acquires this behavior. We have an escalating curve here, which showing that the animal is pressing the bar relatively rapidly. And now at this point, the animal is placed upon extinction. The animal keeps pressing the bar. And the reason why it keeps pressing the bar is that it really can't distinguish that it's in extinction, not at least right away. The animal simply knows that it has to exhibit a lot of bar pressing anyway, so it keeps pressing the bar. But then later on, the animal extinguishes, realizing that it's no longer getting reinforcement. And here we can see that this occurs at a point well beyond the animal that has been placed on that continuous reinforcement schedule. That is, its history is that of receiving reinforcement for every single response that it exhibits. So again, this is called the partial reinforcement effect. Simply put, an organism that has this history of continuous reinforcement, they extinguish really rapidly, much more rapidly than an animal that has a history of partial reinforcement, where they're not getting reinforced all the time. So the persistence of this behavior then extends for over a greater period of time if you're on any kind of a partial reinforcement schedule where you're not being reinforced for every response, response that you make. And again, this is incredibly important in terms of understanding what kinds of behaviors persist and what other kinds of behaviors don't persist as a consequence of reinforcement. So now, I can see many of you probably saying to yourself, well, that's fine and good for rats, but how about humans? Does this really apply to the human condition? And what I want to do is I want to prove to you that it most certainly does. Let's first take a look at the fixed interval schedule. And the example that I want to give to you is the example of a classroom situation. A classroom situation where a professor gives tests at regular intervals. Like, for example, in this class that you're taking now, let's say every 4 weeks, okay, you're given an exam. It's coming at regular intervals. So here's what happens in terms of your behavior. And the behavior of studying, you can consider that to be like the behavior of a rat in a Skinner box that's pressing a bar. What happens is, when do you press that bar? When do you, in fact, study? Well, you do what I did when I was in college. You tend to do your studying close to when the exam is actually going to occur. And indeed, your amount of studying picks up right before the day of the exam. Some individuals engage in what we call all-nighters, which is something that you should try to strictly avoid because it's counterproductive. But you don't exhibit many responses, that is a lot of studying during the first week of class or the second week. It starts to pick up a little bit during the third week. And then finally in the fourth week, you start studying more, right? And again, what's the reinforcement? The reinforcement is to get a good grade or to avoid a poor grade, right? And so the day the test comes, you take the test. and you get your results back, the reinforcement, and now there's another 4 weeks that has to go by before you have this opportunity again in terms of a reinforcement. So what happens during the first week? Not a lot. Second week, not very much. Third week starts to pick up a little bit. Then during the fourth week, again, this very rapid responding that is occurring. That is the studying that is occurring close to the end of the interval. And again, the test comes and, you take the test. And again, this is your opportunity for reinforcement. Again, you're going to engage in yet another 4-week interval after that. This is classic fixed interval behavior. Your behavior in a class like this is based strictly upon a fixed interval schedule. It's just like our rat in the Skinner box that's on a fixed interval schedule. Now take a look at a variable interval schedule. There are some classes that I teach, especially more advanced classes, where I give a lot of pop quizzes. Students never really know when those quizzes are coming. They know that they have to be prepared. They know that they have to study. They have to maintain a relatively steady rate of bar pressing, studying. But the interval, you can be given 2 quizzes in a week and then not another quiz for another 3 weeks. And then a quiz, and then maybe 2 weeks later, you're given one every day. You never know when those opportunities are going to occur for reinforcement. But indeed, those opportunities are going to be coming at irregular intervals. You have to be prepared. You have to exhibit a relatively steady rate of responding, meaning a steady rate of studying. So pop quizzes then produce this variable interval schedule performance of behavior in terms of studying. This is classic variable interval schedules. Okay. Let's now talk about ratio schedules, and let's talk about fixed ratio schedules. Take a look at these women that you see here working in the garment industry in New York City, and they're sewing clothing. Okay. Many people throughout the world work on the basis of a fixed ratio schedule where a set amount of work produces a set amount of reward pay. Okay. And indeed, there are millions of people throughout the world that are on these kinds of schedules. This is classic fixed ratio schedule. Let me tell you about an experience that I had when I was in my high school years. I worked at a furniture factory that made colonial chairs, where my job was to take these 2x2 planks of wood. Again, they were wood that had been glued together into a 2x2 piece of wood. I had to take 60 of these 2x2 planks of wood from one part of the factory to another part of the factory on a metal dolly, okay, that was on wheels that I would push from one part of the factory to another part of the factory, where there was a man working on a saw where he would take these pieces of wood and he would one at a time put them on this saw where it would cut it into the shape of a seat for a colonial chair. And he could do 10 of those in the span of about 15 minutes. And he got paid for each 10 of those seats that he did. Okay, that's what his pay was based on. This is a fixed ratio schedule, and fixed ratio schedules are seen once again throughout the world for people who do piecework. Okay, now our last, I think probably the most interesting one, variable ratio. Gambling behavior is variable ratio behavior. Let's consider someone who is very interested in horse racing and maybe goes to off-track betting almost every single day. And the one day that they're there, the first race, one race that's being run at, let's say, Belmont Racetrack, He's gotten some inside information that suggests that the 3-horse is going to do very well. So what he does is he goes up to the window and he bets, let's say, $50 on the horse to finish first. And he watches what happens on the monitors that are there in OTB, and the horse finishes fourth, so no payoff. Then another race, second race comes along, and again he reads the daily racing form and some of the tout sheets that are out there from experts who kind of guide you in terms of horses that they feel are going to do well. And he sees that this one horse that's being shipped in from another part of the country, from the West Coast, is going to be in this race, and he has high hopes for it. And he bets on this horse, let's say $30 to place, meaning he has to finish second place, at least second. And what he finds is that the horse, when the race gets run, again, doesn't finishes dead last. And then another race comes along, third race. So he wants to bet on this race. Again, he has inside information that this horse that's being shipped in from another country is going to perform very well, is moving down in class, so it's almost certain to win. So he bets this horse to win, and what he finds is that the horse doesn't even get out of the gate, and indeed, so no payoff. Okay, and then another race comes along, and he bets what's called the trifecta, meaning that he has to predict what the exact order of finish will be for the 1-horse, the 2-horse, and the 3-horse. So he bets this, and he puts $10 down, and sure enough, he wins on that, and wins a sizable amount of money. But then he may go for another 30 races before he gets another hit, before he gets reinforcement in terms of a payoff. This is classic variable ratio behavior. You know that old saying that from the New York Lottery, you can't win if you don't play. You can't win if you don't bet. Well, you just don't know when you're going to get a payoff. But what you do know is that you have to keep betting. And indeed, gambling behavior is some of the most persistent behavior in terms of behavior that continues for a long period of time, even though you don't get reinforced. And indeed, that's why gambling behavior is so addictive. Again, this is variable ratio behavior. Consider that concept that we talked about earlier, the partial reinforcement effect, right? These are individuals who are not used to getting reinforced that much, getting reinforced at irregular times, but they know that they must bet. So this kind of behavior is incredibly persistent. Okay, so again, this is how these schedules of reinforcement operate to influence some of the most minute things and some of the biggest things as well in our lives. Your behavior is guided entirely by consequences. Skinner would say entirely by reward. So Skinner says all you need is reinforcement. Okay. He says there is no such thing as free will. You, in every single thing that you do, every act, every behavior, every response, every decision that you make, it's based upon rewards. And indeed, we are entirely controlled by these consequences, much more so by rewards, really, than by punishments, he would say. Indeed, he would say if you're really good with reinforcement, then you don't need to use punishment at all. So this is a very profound statement, and this is incredibly important work that is going to have really important implications for many of the different things that we're going to be talking about as we go along in this area. So we're going to take a look at some of the implications of this work in our next lecture.